represent a real pressure on him? Does it reflect widespread discontent with the government?
In some ways it's just confined to the urban-based population and educated population, whereas out in the rural areas where the vast majority of the population is, people don't necessarily know about this fraud case. And in his own province of Southern Highlands, people, I've been hearing they're happy with him, his performance as Prime Minister. So in a way it hasn't sort of spread out there yet.
Is O'Neill likely to meet the demands? Will he step down?
I can't see it happening, not easily. This is a lot of pressure being brought to bear on him, but he's such a savvy politician. He has supporters in all the right places, all through the Parliament. His government's very solid, or it appears to be, and he's got the support of the police. I think he might well call their bluff. It's one way or another he will have to respond to it, but stepping down, I can't see it. He's looking to see through to next year's election. That's about a year away, and he'll be doing his best in the meantime to discredit the protesters and discredit the fraud squad's efforts to probe this fraud case as being, he's described it as being politically motivated, and he'll be just saying, let the polls decide about my performance as Prime Minister.
But students don't look like they're backing down either, and they're getting more and more support from different parts of society.
Yeah, you're right, and they've been very solid. They've been peaceful and they've shown great unity, so I think it's a real force to be reckoned with. But there will be divisive elements emerging, and some of them are quite understandable. As we've seen, there have been parents of some of the students worried about, look, my son and my daughter is protesting, shouldn't they be back in class studying for their future, which means so much to the home community back in the bush. And then there's the money thing, of course, so that is pivotal. So these pressures will be brought to bear on the students themselves. O'Neill probably knows that, so he'll, I guess, play for time. But the other factor is, of course, the students are sort of signalling that if they don't get what they want, as well as withdrawing from class and their courses, they will spread the message back in their own home districts that O'Neill has not responded to their demands and is not playing fair. So that could be damaging. We'll have to see.
That was Johnny Blades. Reports of job losses on Norfolk Island have been dismissed by the Australian administration there. In 6 weeks, Norfolk will be completely absorbed into New South Wales after Canberra a year ago stripped away the island's limited autonomy. On July the 1st, a regional council with few powers replaces the island's government. Many government workers have received notices advising them their jobs will no longer be required, but the executive director, Peter Gesling, says there will be other jobs and it's likely there will be more positions than people come July the 1st. A spokesperson for the People for Democracy, Andre Nobbs, told Don Wiseman he takes issue with this.
What I'd like to be able to say is that those statements are true and that there is training and upskilling and no one will be left out of a job. The harsh truth of the situation on Norfolk Island since the changes imposed by the Australian government is that a large number, and at least a third, of our public servants have been advised that they're either surplus to requirements or their skill set doesn't fit with the new arrangements.
To be fair, they are surplus to requirements within that job, but there are potentially other positions.
That might sound like it on the surface of what's been said, but already members of the public service have applied for some of those positions that are purportedly available to them, and I have yet to discuss with any of the public servants that have gone through that application process that they've been successful. And unfortunately, it makes it difficult for me to give you some examples, which I do have at my fingertips, but Norfolk being a small island, those people will be easily identified, and unfortunately there is a fair degree of pressure and coercion on those employees at the moment.
Let's presume then that people have lost jobs. What other opportunities exist for them on Norfolk? Any?
There are very limited employment opportunities, particularly at the moment, because of, in effect, a downgrading of the economy over the last couple of years. And so for many of those people, they will be considering whether they stay on Norfolk Island or whether they move away to support their families and their mortgages.
Another thing that has come up, the MP for Canberra, for whom Norfolk Islanders may or may not be voting in the upcoming election, she's very strongly supportive of the actions being taken by the Australian government. She has said things like there are no facilities for women to give birth on the island. Is that the case?
Oh, look, we've got a 23-bed hospital here with a maternity ward and a elderly ward and all of the physio and the pharmacy and pathology. However, what you will find, Don, is that there has been a significant reduction in the funding availability to the Norfolk Island Hospital through our funding agreements with Australia since 2011, and that's meant that we've had subsistence budgeting. That subsistence budgeting has not encouraged doctors with the full suite of skills to be on the island to be able to do anaesthesia and deliver the babies. It's certainly not an issue from our context that the infrastructure is being taken away. The infrastructure is still there.
People for Democracy spokesperson Andre Nobbs. Low-lying island nations are leading the charge when it comes to ratifying last year's Paris Climate Change Agreement. Of 197 countries which are party to the agreement, only 15 island nations and the Palestinian Authority have signed or ratified it since it was opened last month. The agreement will not come into force until at least 55 countries have signed and 55% of global emissions have been covered. The 16 nations who have signed so far represent only 0.04% of the emissions reduction target. But a climate change specialist at the UN's development program, Kevin Petrini, says more countries are expected to follow the lead.
There are some really good indications. When we look at sort of the top 10 emitters globally, which include countries like China, the US, Russia, and India, and there have been some indications, particularly from the US and China, the two biggest global emitters, that they would be looking at depositing their instruments of ratification later this year, which would go a long way towards the 55% of the global emissions that would allow this to come into force.
So even with the people who have sort of made signals that they will or they intend to sign on, this won't be kicking in anytime this year?
Yeah, at this point, what happens is that if that threshold is reached up to, I think, a month or two before the Morocco meeting in November this year, which would be the COP22. Paris was the COP21, and Morocco will be the COP22. That's the Conference of Parties. If the entry of force happens into enough time before that, in essence, it could kick in this year. But that's a sort of a tough call to see, when countries will actually deposit their instruments of ratification. So it is a potential, yes, that it could, but I guess probably, could just take a bit longer as well.
And in bigger picture, with years and years of negotiations on climate change, this is actually quite a positive step forward.
Yeah, it really sends a clear signal to the world that, the governments of the world are very serious about this, and it sends a very clear signal to the private sector as well. And you have statements, in the Paris Agreement that talk about, basically, without using the term, but decarbonization by the second half of the 21st century. So it's a very strong signal, and I think that there's a lot of change in the way people are thinking about the future and how to produce energy, how to use their land, and other types of activities.
Just going back to the agreement itself, once this kicks in and comes online, what is it countries will be agreeing to?
Yeah, what they're agreeing to do is quite a bit about it has to do with transparency. What they've done is they have produced what's called a net determined contribution once it comes into force. So that's the country's own vision on how they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that'll be submitted for scrutiny amongst the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that's really important because it was discussed that there'd be no backsliding as we move forward. So any commitments that countries make now will be ratcheted up over the years. So this provides sort of a floor for what the ambition will be, and over the years it'll only get higher. And I think that's one of the real strengths of the Paris Agreement, is that as time goes on, it'll